Welcome to Storytelling with Data, the podcast where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters with best-selling author, speaker, and workshop guru, Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Cole.
Hi, this is Cole. Thanks for tuning in. I am joined today by the newest member of the Storytelling with Data team, Simon Rowe. Simon, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's very surreal having flown in from America just on Sunday to spend a couple of days in Milwaukee, a couple of days in Chicago, and now be here where the podcast happened. It's fantastic.
Yeah. So as those listening might be able to tell, Simon is from the United Kingdom. London to be specific. But as we record this, he is actually sitting across from me in person at Storytelling with Data headquarters in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I think you've been to the Midwest before, but is this your first time in Milwaukee?
It is. It's one of the states I didn't get to do. I did a 3-month trip across America and I covered, I think, around 42 states.
Oh, wow.
And Wisconsin was one of the ones I didn't get to cover. So ticked off the list as well. So really good.
Simon has just wrapped up an intensive 8 weeks of onboarding and is here in the Midwest getting some in-person time with some of the team and also co-facilitating some client workshops. Now, Simon, I recall us early on having a conversation on some of the different ways that you were excited about sharing content. And you seemed especially intrigued by the idea of recording a podcast. So fast forward a couple of months, and here we are. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today. Our topic is how to become a trusted advisor as an analyst or as an analytics team. Simon has great depth of experience here from his career up to this point in financial services. We'll share more about that through our chat. But to kick things off, Simon, I think you have a story for us.
I do. And this story takes me back, I'd say about 4 years to 2018 when I was working in the bank I was with. And it was a large project that was currently being undertaken. And we were part of this project, a number of different teams, a number of different stakeholders, and it had a number of different direct client impacts. So our role within the project was to analyze and track the clients through the various movements, the stages of the project, the transitions they were going through. And it didn't start out too well. We sort of lost track of where some of the clients were. So that meant we had the possible jeopardy of telling clients they were in the wrong stage or making sure that clients were at the end of the transition when they weren't really, they were at the beginning. Stakeholders got a little nervous at this stage, wondering whether or not we had a good handle on what was going on. So at that point, my boss came to me and said, Simon, can you just step in and oversee this from our team's perspective? So I said yes, happily, as long as I can do a couple of things. I wanted to clear my diary, clear my schedule. I had other responsibilities, but I felt this was a really important one to just clear the decks to make sure that I had sole focus on this. The second thing was I did nothing. I went upstairs, I sat with the team, and I just observed. So I didn't get actively involved. I just listened, I watched what they did, I asked questions when I needed to in terms of the process that they followed, how they tracked these clients, how they moved them through the different stages. So I got a really good understanding of the whole process, which gave me that education that I needed to then have a conversation with the stakeholders, the project managers. And the other thing I did was to give a regular update to the project managers because they hadn't had that before. They always had to ask for an update, what was going on, what was happening. Whereas I thought, let's be proactive and let's tell them what had been done during that day, what the next priorities were for the following days. If anything had gone wrong, be upfront about it, confront it at that point. And it was after, I guess, a couple of weeks of doing this that the project manager said to me, I really, really appreciate you being here. I have absolute confidence and trust in what you say. And that kind of word really resonated for me because you don't get that often in analytics. Normally you get, that was interesting data, or thanks for the insight. You don't get things like confidence and trust. And it really resonated with me that I got to that position where I was in that trusted advisor type capacity. And so the project continued. We got a lot more confidence, and it was a successful outcome in the end.
That's fantastic. Let's pick up on one of those phrases, which is trusted advisor. So it's very business speaky. How can we translate that? Because I think the idea behind it, the trust that you displayed or earned through that specific project, this is something that can help anyone who's working with data and who has clients or stakeholders on the other side of that. So can you explain more about what that looks like? And I think we'll get from there into how you can actually go about building that.
Sure. So I think ultimately the way I see it is someone having confidence to place their priorities in your hands, if you like. A lot of people, especially in business and other areas, will try and control things because maybe they don't allow others in. But if you can get to that position of being trusted, they will allow you to see what their priorities are, allow you to discuss their jeopardies, what things keep them awake at night. And it allows you to build that just back and forth communication that I think is often missing, certainly in data teams, where a lot of it is around reactive responses. So things that come to mind when I think about how I've judged myself as a trusted advisor, they ask you for advice, simple one, but they're not telling you to do something. They're asking, should this be done? How would I go about this? Can I just run something by you? Those sorts of phrases really came to mind. Being invited to meetings before the project kicks off is another really good example that they really want your input. They trust what you're going to say. And just other things like not imposing timescales. So it's really often you get requests come in and they say, I need it by the end of the day or the end of the week. But towards the end, it's getting to the stage where they were asking for you, how long do you think this will take? And you can go back and you can say, well, I think this will take a couple of weeks. And that their response won't be, I want it sooner. It will be, I trust you, I judge your opinion. And I think that, a couple of weeks is absolutely fine.
So it's really about being more in this partnership sort of role versus the teller and the doer, if you will.
Definitely. I mean, it's very similar to a really good consultancy type aspect where you build up that relationship, like you say, that back and forth, and you can have a conversation on a level playing field rather than this hierarchical server master type approach.
So you talked about some ways that you can gauge whether you have that. It sounds like a lot of them come back to being included. You're included in the meeting, you're included in the discussion, asked to brainstorm or give advice. Are there clear indicators of when you have not reached this point and might need to build to it?
Definitely. I mean, one of the things that is often seen is when you work with data, you can often be seen in this kind of service type role. And with the service type role, you take things like restaurants or emergency services. You're waiting for something to happen. You're waiting for someone to call you, waiting for someone to make an order. And then you react to that order, to that phone call. And that could be seen, I think, certainly in the data side. And if you respond to that, you can get into this process, this cycle, where all you're doing is responding, reacting to people's requests. And I think that isn't a great position to be in, one, because that will continue from the stakeholder perspective. They will just keep asking and not really asking for input or asking for equality. But two, from an analyst perspective, you don't really build up much confidence that what you're doing is justified or valuable to the business because you're just responding to instructions.
But is that reactive piece, is that a necessary part of the progression? So if you think of the analytical journey or the development of an analytics team and capabilities, that is where it starts, right?
Definitely. And typical analytical journey, there's a few ways that this has been talked about, but one way that I really like is 4 stages to the journey. You start off with the sort of descriptive stage. And what that is you're just producing reports, dashboards about what has happened. So how many sales have we done? How many contacts have we made? How many clients do we have? So you're giving valuable information to the business, but it's all about what's happened in the past. If you can move on from that You can look at the diagnostic. Why has that happened? So you're looking at your reports, there's a spike, identifying and researching and explaining why that has happened. So the next stage, you get a little bit more buy-in from the stakeholders with that. The third stage, the predictive. So this is where you can start to forecast using trends, something as simple as forecasting in Excel or just trend lines, run rates, that kind of thing. But all the way through to the really advanced data science, machine learning, AI, predictive models. That's all predictive, but you're trying to tell the stakeholders, where do we think we're going? But the place to really try and get to, and that's where I think you really get into this sort of trusted advisor type of space, is the prescriptive. What do I need to do? So you're telling your audience, what's your recommendation? What do you think the decision should be? What action should they take? What conversation do we need to get started?
And so as you talk about moving through these stages, from the descriptive, the what, the diagnostic, answering why, then getting into the sort of sexier analytics, where you're now able to start to tell people things that they maybe didn't even know they wanted to know or that would be valuable, to then saying, all right, I've done all of that, and now I know your business well enough, I know the context well enough that I can actually make smart recommendations about what you should do next, or help guide that conversation or options to consider. In my experience, these are stages that you have to go through, right? Yeah. You can't jump from not having any data or analytics capability to suddenly being prescriptive to your stakeholders and tell them what they need to do. That's a recipe for failure.
Yes.
But you can't skip through these too quickly, because you have to bring others around you along with you. So even if you as an analyst or you as an analytics team or function feel strongly about your ability to be able to move quickly into the predictive space, you still have to slow down oftentimes, I think, so that you can bring your clients and your stakeholders and the others that you work with along with you, and so that you have that partnership right by the time you get there.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've been with examples where we've tried to move too fast, like you said, and you produce a really, say, a novel chart type, or maybe something that's more predictive, or you begin to tell people what to do before you've earned that right, if you like. And yeah, it doesn't go well, because there's that resistance to either accept a different chart type, or why are you telling me what to do? You are just a service function. So no, you do have to build up that credibility. You have to justify and show that you know the business well enough. The thing that I always think with the analytical teams, data teams, is you've got to be an expert in data. So you might be a data scientist or an engineer or coder or visualization specialist. So you've got to know that side of things, which is really complicated in itself. But you've also got to know the business. And if you don't know the business, you can be a really great analyst, but you're just not going to get that credibility. So researching the business, knowing the business, is fundamental as well to building up through those stages.
In the example that you shared in your story at the onset of the conversation, getting that context, right? Getting to know the business was that part where you were sitting and observing and probably asking questions, which is one way to do that. Also makes me think of, so when I worked at Google on the people analytics team, we definitely went through this process that you described. The team came together and we started by just being descriptive and figuring out what data is there and what sense can we make of it? What new things can we learn? And that was very exciting for us, but to help that be as useful to the business was something that came later over time. And actually, when we got to the part where we're coming up with our own analyses and getting out of that reactive space and trying to get into the prescriptive piece and helping guide those conversations and those strategies, we ended up actually changing the organization of the team and creating a new role it was the point of contact, because we were the analytics team in the HR function, which meant we were trying to serve the human resources teams that then served the different parts of the business. And so it's this multi-layer thing. So by having a point of contact, and I played this role for many years, I was part of the analytics team, but I was actually almost like an honorary member of the sales team. and which meant I sat in the HR that supported sales. I sat in their team meetings. I gave my weekly update to Leanne at the time, who ran that group. And what that allowed for was to build this sort of partnership that you talk about, because that meant I could get an understanding of what sort of things they were dealing with, and through them, what sort of things was happening in the sales organization, get that important context that I could then bring back to the analytics team. But also, I've got one foot on the analytics tier in the analytics team and know what we're doing. And so rather than everything we're doing, just serving it up, I could pick and choose when and how I brought some of the more novel or new things in at times when it was more likely to be accepted or useful or needed. That is not a process that happens overnight. It takes time.
It isn't. And there's some other ways. I mean, I guess if you're a little bit earlier on in that journey and you may be a more junior member of staff and you've got a line manager that would typically go to these meetings, one thing that I found was really useful was just asking them, can I join this meeting? Even just in an observation capacity, because it's very often you would produce a piece of work that you're really proud of. You gave it to your boss, who then takes it into a meeting. And the meeting's over, boss comes out, and you say, well, how did it go? And they say, yeah, it's great.
But what does that mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Or even worse, they say, yeah, it was great. Got a few follow-ups. I'll talk to you about it in the morning. And you then go to bed worrying, what does he mean, follow-ups? Have I got to do more work? I had a plan for tomorrow, but now it's going to be thrown into chaos because I've got to respond to these things. So just by going to these meetings, you can see, well, really, what are the priorities of the stakeholders? Did they really mean for that to be followed up? Or actually, is it just my boss kind of wanting to get a bit more credibility, so he's asking for things that maybe don't need to be done? But also you can see really what interests and what the priorities of the stakeholders are. By being
Listen to what people are talking about
Exactly.
and how they're talking about it. And you figure that's even easier probably today than it used to be when so many meetings are virtual and you could literally be a fly on the wall.
Yeah, definitely. We had teams in remote locations and they were often sort of felt disconnected because they weren't able to go to the headquarters to have the meetings. But the minute with the pandemic, they were able to join these sessions. They were able to contribute far more. We saw a massive kind of morale increase by having these things virtually, where they were able to attend and participate.
So getting feedback is important. And if there's a way to see how your work is being used and hear people talk about the topics that are related, helps, right, as you iterate and refine. For the analyst, what else can people do as they're trying to either work through these 4 stages that you described or as they're trying to form these sort of partnerships?
Yes, I think, as I mentioned, the business knowledge is key. So can you increase your business knowledge either by spending time with your stakeholders, but even if you can't do that, there are things that you can do. So business communications, reading those, time in the industry. A lot of people that I know had a really good knowledge about the company we work for, but didn't know anything about the broader industry. But knowing that kind of thing gives you that extra credibility. It also builds up your confidence to have those discussions when you speak to the more senior stakeholders. I remember networking events, and I used to dread them, and I got invited to one with some senior leadership. It was a reward of doing a good piece of work, but I saw it as
here's the reward, do something uncomfortable.
Exactly. So it was this networking type thing. But the reason I went is because it was a theatre trip, so it was going to see a show in the West End. So that was amazing, and I thought if I could get through the networking bit, I'd seeing a nice theatre show, and I don't have to talk to anyone because it's obviously at the theatre. But I went to this thing, and I saw a couple of people and had a bit of an awkward small talk. But then, as we got more into the evening, I had some really good chats with people and conversations that I never would have had in a business context. And we talked about more social things. But I got some really good relationships out of that, and ones that I'd almost now call friends rather than colleagues. And so just that social time is so important as well. If you can get that with stakeholders, it's not always possible, especially when it's more remote nowadays, but it's certainly really, really important if you can do that as well.
Well, and I think having those sort of interactions helps keep it personal in ways that's useful, that it's actually a person on the other end of it. Like you're not working with a stakeholder, like you're working with Bob or Jill, and you know that they like football or whatever the case may be.
Exactly. And that's the thing, because it's so easy, especially when it's virtual, just to go straight into a meeting and discuss the meeting. But having that conversation beforehand, having that small talk beforehand, just you get to know them as a person. So you get to know then how you can respond to them. You get to know how they're feeling. You can read their body language. Or, are you having a bad day? What's up? Yeah, you can have those conversations that just make it just far more personable than reacting to a business request.
So we've talked about some things that an analyst can do, I think, both to gauge where they're at in this process as well as build that trust, form those partnerships. What sort of, I know you have managed a team and helped others do this. So for those listening who might be in a role where they're managing an analytics team and want to help their team get this trusted advisor status, form partnerships, what advice do you have there? Any stories to share?
Yeah, and a lot of it will be just trying to filter down those same aspirations. You're trying to get to know the stakeholders better, inviting my team members into team meetings, the other thing I did as well was give my team, or try to give my team, a lot of responsibility. So rather than me going into a team meeting or a meeting with stakeholders with that particular member of the team, actually say to them, look, you can do this. The background, once they were ready and comfortable, of course, but you know the background, you know what's going on. It's easy if you go in with someone else, certainly someone more senior, that you default to them when you get questions, or the stakeholders default to the senior person for questions. I've been in meetings with my boss and I've been presenting, but the stakeholder then addresses my boss when he wants to ask a question rather than me, and you feel a little bit devalued. So I think if you leave people to themselves, they will rise up, answer those questions, and then of course you have the feedback afterwards to go through that. So certainly,
well, and then just them knowing that they have your confidence going into that.
That's a big thing.
That you're going to provide air cover probably if needed, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge thing. And so a lot of my team were actually just almost solely responsible for the pieces of work they were doing, just with me adding that kind of oversight, as you say, at the start. So that was a big thing. I mean, the other thing I'd say is when your team's doing a piece of work, always ask, kind of, what else can you do? And a lot of our team was providing dashboards and reporting. And so I'd often ask them, was there anything else you can add to this? Whether it be just by way of bullet point commentaries or a little bit of extra analysis on a piece of work. Because if you can send that to the stakeholder along with the dashboard, it shows that when you're thinking about their business, you're thinking about their priorities and just giving that extra lens rather than just churning out dashboard after dashboard.
Well, and that can be a great way both to demonstrate how you can provide incremental value, which you can then ratchet up potentially over time, but also to get some of that feedback or insights from the people on the other end of it. Because if they say, oh, that was helpful, can you do that again? Or you don't do that the next time, they say, well, but where's the summary? Now you have a clear indication that somebody's looking for that and it was useful in some way. And then that can build in positive ways.
I remember there was a time we had a big management program come in, and there was this new concept of a dashboard, and it was the concept of a T-bar, and it was a landscape dashboard, and there's the shape of a T, and our metrics had to be laid out in the shape of a T, because that's the analogy was if you're a pilot in an aircraft, all your controls are directly in front of you or to the side. Okay. So that was the concept. So we redesigned this dashboard. We picked all the new metrics, all the relevant metrics. First time I went into the meeting to present this dashboard to the exec leadership, it was an amazing session. Every metric we went through in detail. We had recommendations. We had, well, let's discuss that, or we should do something about that. It was amazing. Second week.
Because it was fresh and new and exciting.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. Second week, we followed up from the first week. So all the outstanding actions, it was another great conversation. 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks later, I was taking this dashboard in.
Yeah, here it is again.
And it was stale. There was nothing changing. So I began to not really enjoy the meeting. I almost began to go in there thinking, I hope it overruns this meeting so I don't get to say anything at the end, or
hope you get pushed off the agenda.
Exactly, pushed off the agenda, or say things like, well, there's not much to talk about here, so we don't mind if we move on, that kind of thing. And I thought, that's no place to be in. So in the end, I began to take the dashboard, look at some of the key themes, look at what was interesting, and build my own extra layer on top. So if it was contacts were low, well, actually look at why contacts were low, and then bring things in addition.
So use the dashboard to figure out what could be interesting, and then dig further into that, be able to bring those stories.
Exactly. So it then became the meeting. Well, here's the dashboard. Not really going to talk about it, but it's there for context. But the thing I want to bring to you today is why contacts were low last week. And that formed a much better discussion. Every week felt different. And sometimes it didn't always work. Sometimes they said, no, we knew that, didn't really need to worry about that. But it still generated the conversation. So that was another really good thing is, can you get your dashboards done quickly and automated so you can then add the value afterwards?
And then you know that people are paying attention, right? Because you're actually there for the conversation, and you continue to gain more of that insight of what do people care about, what do they not, what additional context are they bringing in, or that you should be next time. And that cycle can go in a really productive way. Let's talk for a bit, though, about the non-productive sort of cycles. You mentioned one word early on that I wrote down and underlined, which is control. I guess we've talked about a number of scenarios where things are rosy and you do something and then at the end it all works out and everybody's friends and valuing work. But there's the other side of that as well, right? Which is either before you get there or you've tried employing some of these strategies and you're still being met with resistance. So I can think of a specific anecdote back when I was working in the bank, and we had a corporate analytics function, and then we'd had analytics functions that sat in each of the business lines, which I think is a fairly normal setup. And one of these business lines had been relatively recently acquired. And so the people there, understandably, were very closed in terms of they didn't want to share their data. They didn't want to share where they got it from or how they got it or their definitions. They wanted to be the providers of that because that was their value. And you can understand why this happens, right? And especially going into a new organization where they don't know the people, they don't know the culture, they don't know what the plan is for that business unit. There's this fear of potentially, if I'm open, I might become obsolete. Somebody else might step in and do this role better or faster or whatever. But it leads into this really awful cycle of not sharing. And then two people from different teams are trying to do the same thing and the numbers come out different. And now it's us versus them. And that can be bad because that's the knee-jerk reaction. But when you step back and think about it, or as you're hearing about a scenario like this, you want to be open and share openly because that's how you can work together and build bridges instead of these silos.
And you can see a lot of that with consultancies that come in as well sometimes. So a consultancy comes in and they are on a particular project. And you have that, like you say, that defensiveness to say, well, we could do that. What's so special about this consultancy that have come in? And you have to look at it in a different way and say, well, why has the management team decided to pay for this consultancy to come in? Because either they don't know what you can do, and therefore you need to publicize yourself better, do a bit more PR, if you like, or they just don't think that you can do that same type of work, that same standard of work. So promoting yourself as well, I think, is really important to avoid those issues that can come up. And we've had examples where consultancies came in and it got a bit defensive. Why should we send you the data? We've got it. We could do it. But they say, well, we need it. And of course, they're sponsored by pretty senior people. So often they win the argument and it gets a bit of a negative relationship at the start.
And so then how do you overcome that?
You overcome it simply by talking and trying to build that relationship. And often when you see things like emails, you can't detect tone on them.
Yes, or you read in a tone that may not be present.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to do that. Or you see meeting requests come in without any context, you're immediately on the defensive. But oftentimes when you have that meeting and you get to know the real person and it's just a normal person and they've got their priorities and you can explain yours, it becomes a lot better. So really, it's just trying to build that relationship. There's nothing too scientific about it. And then, of course, you can work with them and say, well, we could do this bit for you if you take on this other part. Actually form a bit of a partnership. And I have seen it work really well as well when consultancies do come in, give that nice overlay and that really good senior management relationship hand-holding them through the process, but the data team works with them. It can work really well. It's really, really powerful.
A slight twist on this, but you made me think of it with the idea of a consultant coming in, somebody who is new to a team or new to an organization. I think there can be a tendency to want to prove value quickly, which sometimes takes the form of wanting to redo things that people have done before or show that you could do them better or faster or in some way. And this can backfire also, right? Is there anything special that someone new coming into an organization or a team should do as they're trying to both build that sort of trust amongst their immediate team, but then through the partnerships beyond that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think when someone new comes in, often we have an onboarding plan of some description. And that onboarding plan we'll learn a bit about the business, maybe some technical things to go through, learning the tool that maybe is being used in the business. So there'll be some of that. And when we had someone new come in, I wanted to be alongside them by quite a lot of the time. So I wanted to make sure I was there to support them.
Literally, like sitting side by side? Or
it started that way, and then with the pandemic it became virtual. But yeah, it was so much nicer to be in person and sitting side by side with someone, because you could just glance over and just see which direction they're going in. But I didn't really have many occasions where someone would come in and try and take over. A lot of the time it was they were coming in to replicate reports, or they were coming in to replace someone, and so therefore the job pattern was quite similar. Where I did see some really good productivity though was people that came in who said, I don't really want to do this as my role. I want to do something more interesting. So I'm going to take this thing in the way it was, and I'm going to try and automate it or make it better. We used to do mailings to clients, and the process was really long and really manual, and you had to run loads of different steps in the process.
You said mailings?
Mailings,
okay.
Yeah. And I said to this guy, well, if you don't like doing it, try and make it quicker, so you can actually do things you do want to do.
Make it a small part of your job.
Exactly. And he absolutely took that on. So he learned how to code, he learned how to automate with various scripts and things like that. And he got this process so slick that he was able to spend much more of his time doing value-add things, or what he perceived as being value-add things.
Well, and that, just going back, right, to the stages before, that's an important part of that as well, where you start out oftentimes as an analytics team or function being descriptive, figuring out what you don't know, starting to report out on that. But then the sooner you can, once you have general agreement on that, the sooner you can automate it, because then that allows you to continue to move up that cycle of now having time to be able to dig into the more interesting things and provide increasing value as a result of that.
The flip side to that is the people that don't want to do that, because they see if you're reducing their work, then their capacity is increased, and
yes.
then are they at risk from some kind of reclassification or worse, job losses. And I think it's building that confidence in them that there's plenty more work there, but it's much more value added if you can get this dashboard automated or this process automated. And I think there's this sort of comfort blanket that some people might have.
It is a different skill set, though, right? As you move through these different stages, and then individuals have to decide whether they want to move along with it or not.
Yeah, for sure. Because some people just like producing reports and they're quite happy doing that, and that's their job. But some people, like you say, just do want to move on and work.
So another twist on a scenario that we've not talked about yet, because much of this is, we've talked a little bit about what can you do as an analyst, but a lot of it's been team focused. What about the solo analyst? I can think of an example. Randy, my husband, when he was running HR at an organization in the Bay Area, when he started, they didn't have anybody doing analytics on the people side, because it's a relatively new idea that we should analyze people data too, or that there's value that can come from that. But he, coming from Google, had seen this in action and knew the value of it, and so hired the first people analyst on the team, who actually didn't have a HR background. He was from the finance side. So you come in, you know the data, you maybe don't have all the context you need either on the business or the subject matter. Where do you start there, or what tips do you have for someone in that space when it comes to being successful and forging those sorts of partnerships that we've been talking about?
Yeah, again, a lot of it goes back to my scenario where I said I just almost didn't do anything for the first couple of days is just trying to absorb as much as you can in the first period of time you're there. So rather than getting too involved, because it's easy to get so involved in your work that you don't spend any time in developing. And so you can get wrapped up in the production element or producing the work. So learning about the business, speaking to people, almost taking a step back, absorbing the information. So then when you do go back with a piece of work, you know the context it sits in, or you know the priorities of the people that you've been speaking to. Certainly would be areas that I would definitely focus on initially if I was to, a bit like when I started here. The first 8 weeks is a lot of just listening and reading and watching videos. It's not doing a workshop on day one, because you need to...
That would be problematic,
right? It would be a challenge. It would be an interesting challenge. Yeah. But you feel so much more comfortable after 8 weeks because you've seen it in action, you've watched it in action, you've got the background, the context behind these things. So, it takes a while. And I think a lot of teams do expect people just to come in and hit the ground running. And I don't think that's very fair on a lot of occasions, because you do need to build up that knowledge beforehand.
Well, and sometimes you can do it in stages where I think for sure at first joining any new team or organization or project, you have to start out doing what you described, where you observe more than you speak and are a sponge and can take all of that in to understand the audience and the scenario and the constraints and why things have been done the way they've been done, because somebody decided that for some reason. And so gaining that context so that you don't do stupid things is really smart. But after a little bit of that, then I think there is often value in understanding where is there low-hanging fruit? Where are there things that I might tackle that are going to be probably relatively easy, relatively low risk, that's both going to build my credibility as the analyst or in the function, but also build that confidence and make you feel like you're getting something done of value as you continue to gather more. And then that can build over time.
Yeah. Sure. Certainly the lowest hanging fruit for me, and what I said to people was, what extra information can you add to something? Whether it be a report, whether it be a dashboard, what else can you pick out? And one example we had recently, just before I left actually, was a piece of work that we did, a 3-page report. And the stakeholder said, can you give me some commentary on this? And my team member said to me, do I have to? I said, well, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you want
it's
to
provide... It's an opportunity, not...
Exactly. Why wouldn't you want to provide this extra commentary? And so they did, and did a pretty good job. And then a couple of weeks went past and they didn't get any response from the stakeholder. So the stakeholder didn't reply back and say, oh, great job, great commentary, thanks a lot for the insight, really useful. So they didn't do it the next time. But then as quickly as they sent it, they got the response back. Where's the commentary?
And that can sometimes be useful to take things away to see if people value them.
Exactly. But it really was valued just because they hadn't noticed it and appreciated it. I think that can be the trouble, certainly in remote virtual world, is you don't always get the recognition that maybe you think you might deserve. Whereas if you're walking past someone in the corridor or handing them the report, they would obviously say this is really useful. And if you don't get that, you can feel a little bit isolated or disconnected. But it's important to know that what you are providing is useful, is value add, and you should keep doing it.
Well, and then there's an important lesson for the receiver in this too, which is when something is done that is helpful, be vocal about that, because that sort of feedback is useful and not always known otherwise.
Yeah, no one knows unless you say something. So so many times you get something back, or you don't get anything back, or what you do get back is sort of more questions, or this is great, would be good if you could do this. This is great, kind of like, in between. And you just feel a little bit devalued. So it's really important to keep up that momentum.
And it comes back to communication. It's interesting to me that nearly everything that we're talking about here really comes down to the people side of things. Taking time to get to understand the context and the audience and their needs. And I'm totally generalizing here, but oftentimes those who are inclined to build roles for themselves or be in roles where they're mostly working with data aren't necessarily as comfortable on the people side of things. Your example of the resistance to providing commentary is a good indication of this sort of thing. So what tips do you have, or what might you share that could help someone who feels uncomfortable about some of the things that we've been describing get more comfortable and confident?
Yeah, the best example for me is, do you know your subject matter really well? Because if you do, you're a lot more comfortable speaking about things you really know about or passionate about. Yeah, it's easy to speak about yourself or your hobbies or interests because that's an area of passion. Can you get to that level with your work? So can you get to a level, even if it isn't passion necessarily, but even if it's a level of just knowledge, you know this content inside out, and you can deal with any question that's asked of you without having to respond back, without having to go back. If you can get to that
becoming
level,
an expert.
Exactly, subject matter expert. If you can get to that level, then that gives you the confidence to go into the meetings, to speak to stakeholders about things, and knowing that you can cover any eventuality that comes out. So that'd certainly be a recommendation to try and get to that level. It doesn't mean you need to be an expert in everything, but if you are producing a report that you're going to take in and present, then make sure you know about how every metric is calculated. Make sure you know about if there is a peak or a trough somewhere, that you know why it happened. So even if you're not necessarily putting out the information yet, you haven't got to that stage, you can answer the question if it comes up.
There can be benefit as well in that scenario. Going into the meeting, you need to know how to answer the questions, but where you may not have the context. And so figuring out how to build that context before you go to the meeting. And that oftentimes means talking to people.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess getting comfortable talking to people if you're not, and asking smart questions and listening and really having an interest in understanding other people's perspectives and needs. It really is the people side of things that helps the analyst really be successful.
Yeah, definitely. And also the other advantage of going in before or speaking to someone before a meeting is you can talk through the thing that you're going to present. And so you can get some feedback, and you either get feedback that might mean changes, which depending on the timing may not be great if you're just about to go in. But if you do get feedback beforehand, you can make changes. But the other thing that's really useful is to get some buy-in, especially if you're going to quite a senior environment. If you can pick off one or two of those members and say, look, I'm going to produce this, I'm going to recommend this, or I'm going to talk through this. What do you think? And if they come back and say, yeah, great idea, I think that'd be really good. I'll back you in the meeting or support you. That
or even just be like leaning forward and nodding when you're saying these things when we meet.
Yeah, showing some kind of interest in it would give you that confidence that, what I'm about to say is at least supported by some of you. And if they've got persuasive powers over the rest of their peers, they can help direct the conversation the way you want it to go.
And this is something that's useful in many occasions, figuring out where are there influencers who you can bring around to share your view so that the conversation goes in the direction that you hope it will.
And it's such a confidence boost to go into a meeting knowing that there's a few people in there that have seen what you're going to do and support it. There's nothing like it. Rather than going completely cold and you're not sure how it's going to come off, and you've done something a bit novel maybe, or you're about to recommend something for the first time, you just got no idea.
That's risky.
It's risky, it's risky, and it's pretty nerve-wracking. So whilst you want to focus all your attention on the presentation, having confidence in doing that, you're also back of your mind thinking, what if someone derails this or asks an awkward question I can't answer? So,
So building those bridges, those relationships ahead of time, and just the talking through it. You mentioned this in passing, but that in and of itself ahead of time can be so useful at then helping the big meeting or the big project go well in your final delivery. So I'm curious in your thoughts, like pivot here, and I definitely have opinions here, but what role does visualizing data play in all of what we're talking about?
That's a really great question, and I could spend probably a bit of time on this. We had some interesting conversations where I used to work about data visualization and whether it should be a role in its own right, whether it should be part of a general analyst role. If it was part of a general analyst role, how much time should be focused on it? And we went through various cycles. We went through this kind of cycle where, you had these different stages. So you got the data, you pass it to someone else to analyze the data, you pass it to someone else to
that makes me
visualize
nervous.
the data. And but then you get that, okay, that's my specialty, and I'm going to pass it on to someone else's factory.
You're just like passing cogs in the process. There's something about the spirit that runs the risk of really getting lost there.
Absolutely. And you think, it's become so broad now, the industry, and so specialized in certain areas, that can you be great at all of those parts, or do you need to focus in on some parts? And that's when you get sort of data specialist roles come in. So then you get the data engineers, you get the data scientists. So then you think, well, again, what part does the visualization, is it the data scientist supposed to visualize it, or do you create a data visualization specialty role? But then what do they do other than data visualization if they've got no context on how it was built?
Right, and then who actually tells the story?
Yeah, absolutely, and who presents it at the end? So we came to the agreement that, you need some specialism, certainly in data science, data engineering, because they are such complex topics now, so sort of focused. But the analyst role can still do a bit of data science, can still clean and manipulate the data, but still needs to have that specialism of visualizing it and being able to present and tell that story. And I think we got to a pretty good place in the end, certainly within our team, of that mix. Because like you say, you don't want to have to take a piece of work and pass it on, because there's no value there to just
it's not fulfilling to the individual, right?
Yeah, exactly. You are just part of a factory process. So I think owning the data, owning the story, owning the analysis behind it, visualizing it in a way, talking to the stakeholders, all those parts we talked about, and then presenting it, and then being in the room to get the feedback. Well, it's a great piece of work if you've done it well.
And even if the direction goes maybe differently, in a different direction than you anticipated going in, because I think this catches people sometimes, where then it feels like, oh, that work was for naught. And it's like, no, that work still helped people make a smarter decision. It may not have been the one that you thought that they should make, but that's where other people are coming in with different perspectives and context. And for me, if it's driving the right sort of discussion and data is being considered in the way that helps that, then that's a win, even if things go in a different direction than maybe was intended or anticipated.
I think then that's the importance of, if you're not necessarily at the end of the process, is the communication from whoever was at the end to say, look, thanks to everyone that's played their part in helping pull this together, right from the engineers putting the data to those analysing it, that you've all been part of this, and you all should be recognised in the same way, not just the person at the end who's done the visualization or done the actual presentation. So it's really important, because from a team morale perspective, to include everyone in that recognition, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So then I think this is a good point to recap some of the main we've covered a lot in a relatively short amount of time. So, one is just the value that you can have as an analyst or bring to your team as you work through the stages that you talked about in an analytical environment and really form partnerships and become this trusted advisor. What are the top tips, thinking back over the conversation we've had, that you would leave people with today?
Top tips would be, certainly as you approach it, is to just absorb yourself in the business. So get to know the business, get to know the context around it, get to know the stakeholders' priorities, what keeps them awake at night. Try and involve yourself in meetings with those stakeholders to see the conversations rather than be part of the actions that are delivered after that. So those are the sort of pre-work, if you like. But once you get into that and get a little bit more of that confidence and you're speaking directly to those stakeholders, ask some questions. Bring that relationship up to a level par. Ask some questions. Why do you think this is important? And why do you want to do this? Tell them no occasionally to bring that level up to, okay, he's telling me no because he's actually got some justification. He's got some credibility. I don't mind that. So those kind of things I think are really important as you progress the relationship. And then obviously as then you present, you show that credibility. You've got the stakeholders buy-in because you've spoken to them beforehand, and the presentation goes well because you've got the confidence from having the knowledge, you've got the confidence from having the stakeholders buy-in and input, and you've just presented something that really is value add, and you're in that prescriptive space where you're recommending things rather than just delivering what we've done type reporting.
Yeah, and I'll just underscore one of the things that we've talked about throughout the conversation, but that's just to talk to people, right? Because open communication, asking questions, really actively listening to the answers and the context that other people bring to the conversation is always going to serve you well as an analyst and in forming these sorts of partnerships.
It's great to be inquisitive and curious
about
things.
Yeah. So before we close, I'll mention that registration is open for our Q2 2022 virtual public workshops. Our classic foundational workshop will be offered in a 4-hour format split over 2 days on May 4th and 5th. We'll also be offering publicly for the very first time a session that's been quite popular with our clients. It's called Craft the Narrative. And that is a hands-on practice session where we lead participants through the low-tech planning process with their own projects. That'll also be a 4-hour session split over 2 days on May 11th and 12th. That's 2022. Space in both of these sessions is limited, so I definitely recommend registering early to secure your spot. More details and registration can be found at storytellingwithdata.com/workshops. For those who might be listening later, you'll find the current schedule posted there as well. As a special thank you for listening, you can use the code podcast10, that's podcast10, during the registration process for 10% off the listed prices. That code also works at our Storytelling with Data shop, where we currently have custom mugs and craft roasted coffee. You'll find that at storytellingwithdata.com/shop. Simon, thank you for joining me behind the microphone today.
Thank you very much, Philip. Absolute pleasure to be here.
And with that, be sure to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and our YouTube channel. Also, check out all the great resources at storytellingwithdata.com. Thanks very much for listening.